Hello, my name is Cesar Cornejo. I'm Senior Lecturer at the Manchester School of Art. I'm here to introduce our guest today, Curator Jade Dellinger, who is going to be talking to graduating students Nola James and Bryn Rogers. Jade is the director of the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery in Fort Myers, Florida, the iconic gallery where Bob Rauschenberg rehearsed 15 solo exhibitions before sending them around the globe. In that position, Jade, since 2013, has curated shows as Yoko Ono, Imagine Peace, Rauschenberg, China, America Mix, Dave Mueller, Everything Sounds Good Right Now, Wayne White, Here Comes Mr. Know-It-All, Keith Admire, Edith Song Impluvium, Graham Branca and Philip Corner, Resound, and Empire and Arturo Vega Retrospective, among others. Before that, as an independent curator, Jade regularly collaborated with the Contemporary Art Museum at the University of South Florida and the Tampa Museum of Art. In 1994, he invited artist Dude Eichen to present his first site-specific video installation, I Die For You, at the Pasco Art Center in Holiday, Florida. He also curated Mauricio Catalan's U.S. museum debut, Choose Your Destination, How to Get a Museum Paid Vacation in 1995, and organized the collaborative Keith Admire and Evil Knievel project in 1997 at the USF CAM. Jade has also curated major solo museum shows for artists such as Alan McCollum, Lucy Orta, Atelier Van Les Hood, Carlos Morales, Janina Chape, Felicia Varini, Keith Haring, and the Art Guys, amongst others. He has contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs and publications, including Flash Art International, Art Papers, Guitar Aficionado, and Permanent Food, and also co-authored the book Are We Not Men? We Are Devo, SAF Publishing Ltd UK, 2003-2008, which traces a history of the seminal 1980s New Wave band. And I also have had the pleasure to work with Jade. He came to Peru with me in 2010 to work with me on a project I'm developing there, and also have worked in other projects together. Also, as a brief introduction to Nola's work, I'll read a brief excerpt from her statement published in her exhibition page. She says, "Within my practice, I found that shifting the emphasis from producing work to instead working out generated a much more interesting kind of production. By removing the need for completion, the work can be held in a state of becoming rather than being, as described by Jürgen Patterheimer. For me, this manifests through processes of investigation and documentation, which in turn becomes the work." With no further ado, I leave you now to the interesting conversation between Jade and Nola.
Well, Nola, one of the things that I found really compelling was actually seeing your slide projector piece. I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about, what inspired that, and as we're having a similar experience online, there they are. One of the things that I don't know if you're aware, but the art critic and curator Joshua Dechter did a project in 1994, and this just brought all of that back to me in an interesting way. There was a show that was called Don't Look Now, and there's actually a catalog that's worth maybe picking up. You can find it on Amazon, and I'm sure you can find it in the UK. But he did a show at Thread Waxing Space, and it for that project he actually invited a good number of artists to design works that would exist just as slides and be projected in the installation. But what sort of brought you to make that particular work, and was it something that then was part of an installation, and or clearly it functions in a really interesting way, I think, particularly if you turn on the sound, but when you're on your website, which I visited, you have a pretty good sense of the experience with having both of those screens and running sort of simultaneously, plus the sounds of the projector. But was that something that was done initially as kind of a class assignment? Was that something that, how did you get to that? What is your interest in sort of making this, using this old technology?
So I think, I can't remember where the first idea actually came from for using the slides. I think I had some of the cases, the little things to slot the images into lying around. And I think a lot of my process kind of starts with like just gathering material and kind of archiving. And I kind of like to think of that research as almost like a kind of collage, I suppose. And like all of my desk at uni was always just piles high of like stacks of printed out bits of paper and drawings and things, and no real kind of order to it that I think would have made sense to anybody else. But it was just kind of the having them on top of each other and next to each other created some kind of collage, or like that was the link enough. And then I suppose I liked with the slide projector how you could do the same kind of thing of rearranging the slides and putting all these different things next to each other to see what would be produced in between them. But have it happen in a sense of like rhythm and time as well, like the rhythm of the images flashing on the screen, and the sound of the carousel, and then the fact that it is a carousel, so it's like this cyclical thing. I could kind of, yeah, a collage that builds up through looking at it in time, I guess I liked.
And when you initially exhibited it, was it multiple projectors, or was that kind of how you envisioned it being? Was it sort of installation of projectors all sort of functioning simultaneously? One of the things that I think is really interesting just from the website is having these multiple screens and multiple projections, and sort of the sound of, of these things kind of happening simultaneously. But also I do love that it's, it's this sort of old technology. It's this, that's probably fairly unfamiliar to, most of your former classmates and or colleagues at the university. It's really kind of outdated, in a great way.
Yeah. I think, I would have liked to have done it with multiple projectors, but I suppose because it's so outdated, there's only one at the uni, so it was limited to just the one. But I think having the like multiple clicking at like different rates to kind of offset the rhythms was what I liked about having them side by side on the website.
Well, and I'm amazed that they still had one. I mean, just even a single projector, and you were able to find, slides that you could manipulate. And to what extent did you actually manipulate the material? I mean, one of the things that was interesting too was that, the one slide that sort of shows, which is there on the screen now, I guess, but that sort of shows, a broken glass slide. Was that something you were really playing with in terms of, did that broken slide make its way into the projection?
No, I would have liked to, but it was so fragile, that broken slide, and like the glass was all kind of falling out, and there was no way for me to stick the glass down without altering what the slide would look like with light going through it. So it just
jamming
kind of
the projector.
right. It just lives as a little piece in an envelope at the minute.
Well, it's interesting, that use of old technology too. I mean, the first project I did at the university, at the college where I'm now at, and at the Rauschenberg Gallery, 7 years ago now, I guess, or 8 years ago now, I had done for the Tampa Museum, and it was the centenary for John Cage. And Cage in the 1960s had, while the technology was current, had developed a project that was about making an installation of records and record players. So the room was filled with records and record players, and people were invited to participate in this, to, pick a record and put it on a turntable. But, and it was called 33 1/3. But because it was the centenary, I invited lots of people that had an interesting connection to Cage. Artists like John Baldessari and Ed Ruscha and Mike Kelly, and then lots of well-known musicians too. David Byrne and Yoko Ono and others, Iggy Pop, to pick records to put into this installation. But one of the things that was so funny was, when we do this in the context of places like the Rauschenberg Gallery, because Cage and Rauschenberg were so closely connected, the students would come in and they wouldn't know how to use a record player, like 8 years ago, or they didn't fully grasp. There was actually someone who asked the question about, oh, it's two-sided, like you can play both sides. It's not like a CD So anyway, this piece to me, has a lot of, is of great interest. So, but I also like, not only are you playing with these old technologies, but at the same time, it is so much this time-based thing, and it's somehow about sort of marking time, and I felt that way and found that in those timeline pieces you were doing too. I thought that was really interesting. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But what was sort of the impetus for the timelines?
I guess I've been thinking a lot about language, and that in relation to time and the kind of process of stringing things out, it kind of left to right and reading, and how that kind of looked, this recording of things like in a linear sense, and how writing could also kind of fit into that linear thing of a timeline. And I was just trying to figure out different ways of filling time, but also creating records of it at the same time. So that was kind of why a lot of the drawings I was doing were also these like left to right things. Yes, that was it really. Just trying to make the length of time into a physical length. So like 28 minutes would be 5 meters or something, and then you could measure how long 28 minutes was, how much it weighed, like how many words it consisted of.
And was that done, sort of as a performance as well, or was obviously you have, as we're seeing now, this kind of documentation, which is beautiful, of you moving across the room, across the floor as you're writing, and you have the marker, which is that you timed yourself, but how does that piece continue to exist? What your question to Ryan Gander actually I thought was really interesting too, that had to do with the way in which one values their work once it's made. It was, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to that effect. And for him, it was about the story and how you continue to tell the story, and what makes this work, your voice, uniquely yours, which I thought was also a good answer and fitting given his work. But with this, I wonder how it continues to exist. Did it begin as a performance? Clearly you've documented the performance. You've maintained those texts as you've rolled them. How does it continue to have a life for you? And how would you show it moving forward?
Yeah, I think the showing of things is always the thing that I really struggle with, actually. Like the making is fine, the thinking is fine, but especially because I think a lot of the stuff that I make is these just kind of bundles of scraps kind of hashed together. It's hard to solidify that into something else, and I think sometimes when I do try and solidify it too much, it loses a lot of something. But I suppose kind of similar to what Ryan was saying, but not quite. I think it continues to have a life with if you make it into a gesture as well as a drawing, like it is an act, like a representative act, then it kind of continues to exist as the act rather than just the physical thing. And I guess also because I don't really like to think about things as finished, the life just comes from, I'll continue to use this writing again and again and again. I'm sure I use the images again for different things and kind of rehash it and use it to figure out other things. So I suppose that's how it has a life for me, but I'm not sure beyond myself yet what that looks like.
Well, I mean, it clearly is marking, 28 minutes of your time and of your life. It's one of my favorite artists, which, while I think this has a different kind of poetry in terms of what you've done, one of my favorite artists is Ankawara. I also think of a quote from Laurie Anderson. She, there's a sort of song lyric, this is the time, and this is the record of the time, as being two separate things,
I
right?
used to have that written on my studio wall.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. I love Laurie's work. I think she's terribly important. I've brought her to the Rauschenberg Gallery, and we have some other projects in the works. So she's quite an amazing artist and thinker. But she's also been doing, which you could tap into, a series of podcasts. She's got a show that she does at 4 a.m. in the morning on a radio station that is a 2-hour program where she's interviewing people and just having the most extraordinary conversations. But the whole idea is that it's happening kind of in the middle of the night, for those who are insomniacs. But that said, with time in Britain, it'd be prime time for you. It's 4 a.m. here. But and the other artist that sort of comes to mind that I don't know if you've looked much at, but is Ankawara, who, is now deceased, but conceptual artist who, since the mid 1960s, 1966, would paint a painting of the date every day. And it was about marking time. He would construct a box to put the painting in, and wherever he was, if he was in New York, the painting would be formatted. It was always on a kind of monochrome background, usually black or sometimes blue, occasionally red or orange. And it was simply about hand painting perfectly the date, and over almost 50 years. It's kind of extraordinary to go back and look at this. He calls it the Today series. And the boxes that he would build and generally would not be exhibited together with the painting. More recently, they have been. He would always put the newspaper from the day in the box. So if there was something important in the headlines, it would influence the way that one might think about the painting of that day or date. And for people, I think, and your sort of general question about how these things have meaning to others, much less have meaning for you. It's a way in which I think we're all obviously bringing what we bring to the work that we see. So, again, for me, this work that you were doing, and even the text, which is like sort of self-referential, it's talking about itself and about the time that you're spending in writing the text, is something we can all relate to, I think, particularly now, and given what's been happening here. So anyway, I thought the timelines were really beautiful, and I really think that's something that would be interesting for you to continue, particularly now. And Ankawara is someone I think you should look at as well. But I'm glad that you're on to Laurie Anderson too, because I think her work continues to resonate, and she's such an amazing storyteller. Her most recent film, which is a couple of years ago now, but Heart of a Dog is definitely worth seeing too, because it's a kind of meditation on death, both the death of her dog, her interest in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bardo, but also the death of her partner, who was Lou Reed. She was married to Lou Reed. So anyway, that's worth seeing too. But I was also really interested in your distance distribution project. So I wonder if you could give us a little background on that, and maybe we can talk more about it.
Yeah. that was basically just over the duration of lockdown, when we'd all kind of moved out of the studios at uni and started trying to make things, you know, at home on our kitchen tables or in our bedrooms and things. Just collating all the things that I'd written or drawn every 2 weeks into little handbound zines, and then distributing them just on my bike. I gathered a kind of list of people. Some of them I knew really well, some of them I hardly knew at all, just from social media, and kind of, I think it ended up being about like 20 people or 20 houses in the end that I'd kind of cycle around every fortnight and drop off these little bundles to. Yeah, it was really nice. It was kind of a nice, one of the first times as well that I started really using my work, thinking about it, because it is all obviously like very introspective, but also yeah, the first time that I'd really started trying to use it as a point of outreach to people, I think.
Yeah. And do you, I mean, is sort of bookmaking, obviously
Nice.
there's also another piece, this piece that he's been showing, but is bookmaking something that is of interest? I mean, I also, of course, I love the idea of the way that you're distributing those works for distance distribution, but just on your bike. But it makes me think a lot about not only the whole history of making artists books, but also sort of simultaneously there was, you know, a great interest too in using the mail or using those existing delivery systems to distribute work in a way that wasn't about galleries, or that wasn't about, you know, there are a number of artists, Ray Johnson and others who also founded Albert Fine, this thing called the New York Correspondence School. But there was a whole thing that I think runs quite parallel with bookmaking, or the idea of artists' books at least, that had to do with distribution. So that idea that you're sort of hand carrying, hand making these things, and you know, dropping them at someone's door, it is really quite remarkable. I love that idea, and particularly in this time when we all feel so disconnected in the obvious ways. So, but did you? I mean, like in terms of the thought of making books, that seems to be an interesting way of distributing things. Are you? I guess you're interested in both things: the idea of showing in galleries or museums, but also having a way to have a kind of intimate relationship with individual viewers or people who take an interest in your work.
Yeah, I think the book is really important for that, for me, I reckon. Um, yeah, I guess, yeah, I like what you say about it being this kind of intimate relationship, because it's so nice that it's, especially when they're hand bound, and I like the one that's on screen now, I kind of make them all by hand, and then it's something else that will exist in someone else's hands, you know, with the scale of it and everything. And it's like a vessel to hold all of the things that you've written or thought about. Yeah, no, I think that is really important. Kind of making it in the extreme sense like a localized experience for the person, like local as in it's, you know, only just a slight extension from their own body when they're holding it and reading it, which I really like.
It makes me think as well. I mean, another person, there was an exhibition at the Henry Art Gallery out in Seattle, but of Laurie Anderson, but it was focused on, it was called Collected Stories, and it was really focused on her books. And she really, at the very beginning, also was making books dating back to like 1970, 71, and started by making these really beautiful little intimate children's books. She got a kind of gig while she was still in school, which was to illustrate these children's books for a fairly major publisher, this company called Bob's Merrill, and she did a book called The Package, and she first illustrated one that was called Certainly Carrie Cuts the Cake, or Cut the Cake. But The Package is purely, a book that is a drawing that tells this sort of story about the delivery of a package on a bicycle, actually. So it's something, it's a bit hard to sort of track down, but Lori also makes the point. I mean, there's a thing that she would often say about, as people were moving toward, and as much as she's identified with technology, or inventing instruments and using technology in innovative ways, the idea that we're all on screens is something that I think she's thought a great deal about. And in that, she sort of made the point that, everyone is sort of complaining that we're on these screens and that we've become so disconnected from one another. But really, if you think about, books, there's nothing more antisocial. You become, it's you with this intimate object in your hands, and you're solely focused on that. So it's sort of the same. So I like that you're kind of doing both and finding a way to put these things in our hands. I wish I could be on your mailing list. Nola, it was really lovely to meet you, and I thank you for doing this virtual studio visit with me, and I do hope we'll stay in touch. If there's anything, again, reach out to me, and follow us on Facebook and that sort of thing, and keep me posted about your work. Send me a book.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Jade will talk now to graduating student Bryn Rogers. As a brief introduction to his work, I'll read an excerpt from the statement published in his exhibition page. He says, "My research explores the tensions that arise from the messaging of popular culture, specifically the construction of hegemonic identities and how we as an audience consume them. I am fascinated by the different manifestations of both celebrity and hyper-masculine iconography. As such, I explore media representations of gender, but most notably that of manhood. I believe that through appropriating the media of my own boyhood, but more widely that of Western popular culture, I can explore the messaging of such media and question the deep-seated values that underpin it." With no further ado, I leave you now to the interesting exchange between Jade and Bryn. Thank you.
Congratulations. I understand you're finished now with MMU, and just I got to see some of your work in the degree show, obviously online, and basically Cesar had approached me about having a look at some of the work, and then I'd been hearing about these curator highlights. But for me, I felt like it was much more interesting to get to meet you and to have more of a conversation than just to post me trying to talk about what you're up to. I really, it's important to me, these connections and relationships, particularly now. So it's really nice to meet you, and I must say I was really moved by the work that you're making. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts on, and also share some of mine. But again, it was fun. I also had a chance to see I guess it was the launch night, your closing celebration, your party, and the conversation with Ryan Gander. And you, because of the nature, I think, of the video work that you make, you had quite a presence in the dance party. Which was great. So that said, I'd love to hear more about your interest in the video. I also would love to talk more about the sculpture, but since I guess we're both seeing the image that's up now of some of your video, what is it that attracted you to some of these World Wrestling Federation stars from the 90s that predates even your birth, I think, right?
Yeah, it's sort of a just nostalgia viewing on YouTube. I grew up watching a lot of like old VHS tapes that you get at like car boot sales and stuff, where it's like it'd be like someone had like recorded the VCR of like 1992 like wrestling stuff from way back when. And I always remember it would be like it was like uncensored, and when I was watching the one that was like more relevant to the era that I grew up in, it was quite censored. That they very much made it for kids more. So I remember it was quite it always sort of struck a chord in that sort of rebellious, youthful side of me, where I was thinking I shouldn't really be watching this, but I'm watching it anyway. I don't think my parents quite knew what it was.
Yeah.
Um,
So there
yeah,
was a distinct change in the 2000s. I mean, like in the 1990s, obviously, we're seeing Hulk Hogan at the moment, but in the 2000s, they tamed it down somehow. Is that right?
yeah, it was. I think in the people who like document it, there's like two eras. Like there's like the
Yeah.
90s was the Attitude Era, and I think then the 2000s was a Ruthless Aggression. Well, they both sound equally as aggressive, but it was a I think it was a process of making it slightly less tame, and there was less blood and less like assaults. And then I think in the 2010s, it's become even more family friendly, and it's like sort of less hypersexualized, and the female fighters especially are sort of treated like less as objects and more as actual competitors in their own right. And it's become much more of a product rather than a sort of manifestation of counterculture.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I had a chance to also look a little bit at your website, but that said, there seems to be on the website something that really becomes more of a kind of documentary. What we're seeing now, obviously, and I don't know if you realize this on 4 screens in a real space, or if I'm assuming we're looking at something that's more virtual here. But is your ambition in part 2 to sort of make a film that is a documentary? Because you had something that's more like a 10-minute thing that I watched.
Yeah, I had a show reel for a documentary that I'm currently working on, and that was my submission for my masters, because I'm intending to do a masters in filmmaking. And so
Oh, fantastic.
I've been working on that sort of parallel with my studio practice, where I've been
Uh-huh.
sort of like taking my contextual research of that and then formulating it in a way that's less abstract in how I present the ideas and the different research patterns that I go through. And that's more like exploring like the yeah, like you were saying, the hypermasculinity in specifically in the 90s, because it was like quite a massive cultural shift that, although I was only born in 1998, it's still like it has that weird sort of nostalgia for a time I wasn't alive kind of sense to
Uh-huh.
it. But yeah, I find it's quite interesting to like, especially look back through the lens
Yeah.
of boyhood and watching that stuff and all your friends, and like, you know, after a rugby match, me and my mates would be choke slamming each other into sofas and stuff like this, like really ridiculous stuff. And it's interesting to look back how that's affected the way I behave and the way I sort of view popular culture in a way.
Yeah. Well, and again, you were finding these VHS tapes, basically. I mean, in terms of finding the documentation of these characters. But were you also, did you come from a place where, I mean, obviously there's also another piece that we can talk about, but that, you know, has soccer celebrations. I grew up playing soccer, and actually my first trip to Europe was to play soccer in
Oh, really?
northern England and Scotland when I was a teenager. So which was just changed my life, you know. But I also grew up in a family where there was a real connection to professional athletics, because my great grandfather, who lived until I was 20, actually, he was well into his 90s and in great condition, great physical shape. He had been a professional baseball player, and actually renowned, like he's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I grew up around Mickey Mantle and, you know, Joe DiMaggio and people like that, but knowing my great grandfather, so like sort of the sports connection has always, and you know, I continue to play soccer, but has always been a connection that I feel, you know, kind of deeply about. And also my first museum experience actually was not going to an art museum, but it was actually going to the Baseball Hall of Fame Museum in Cooperstown, New York, and being there with him and having this kind of remarkable exchange, in that I had only known, you know, I must have been 8 or 9 years old, but I had only known my great grandfather, you know, as family, and some sense that he had been an important person, but when we arrived at the museum, at the Hall of Fame museum, the baseball museum, he was immediately pulled aside, and people were lining up for his autograph, you know. And as a kid, I didn't know what to make of that. It was like this crazy thing going on where everyone needed his attention and wanted his attention, and we're trying to get him to sign baseballs. But the museum director, which I think has kind of led to my trajectory, the museum director pulled me aside and trying to entertain me, I guess, but said, there's something really special you need to see. So the director took me into the museum, and actually, you know, through all of the displays, and at some point we got to a vitrine, you know, just a glass case, and inside it were my great granddad's baseball bat, and also like some dirty spikes, you know, his cleats, his shoes. And as a kid, you know, it was like, I saw him dressing in the hotel this morning. He helped me put my shoes on. I'm really, you know, so the idea that a museum functions to, you know, reify and you know, the separation between the things in culture that we value and the things that are seen as historically significant, you know, I think really stuck for me. So anyway, this connection to sports, I think, is a really interesting approach that you're taking. And I also love the idea that you might do a documentary film about you know, about this era in sports, because I do think it's quite unique. So in terms of these characters, clearly you're picking people that were, you know, at the height of their careers and as popular culture figures. Hulk Hogan, obviously, you know, had quite a long history in wrestling, and we're looking at, I guess that's Stone Cold Steve Austin, right?
Yeah.
But he would do the old school thing about cutting himself, right? Like hiding a razor or something.
Yeah, that was quite a big thing, as a blading. It's like,
Yeah.
there's a weird culture surrounding it, which was quite interesting to like discuss. Was that there's a sense of like pride in the masochism of it, where you're pretending that you're hurt, but you're also, in order to pretend you're hurt, you have to actually get hurt. And they take a sense of, it's like the weird duality of the performance, where it's like it's staged, but at the same time they're performing it in a way where through cutting themselves they have to make it real.
Yeah.
And it's this idea
There
that
is
it's like, who can
a
be the big
masochism in
man,
that.
who can take the most damage. It's like to look back at that with a slightly more contemporary lens, and I think there's a lot of room to explore the sort of both the absurdity but also the mentality that's implicit in it.
Yeah. I mean, it was really a masochistic thing. I mean, if you look at some of those old school wrestlers, their foreheads are really scarred, and
like a washboard.
Exactly, and your head bleeds like remarkably so. It's really incredible to kind of watch. When I was sort of in the 80s and 90s, growing up nearby here, on the west coast of Florida, there's a beach that we would go to that was called Reddington Beach. And it was always an interesting, you know, I kind of grew up in the 1970s and into the 80s. And in the 70s, I was interested in, not of course soccer, but so much of the professional wrestling was actually happening in sort of the Gulf Coast of Florida. And so I went to matches. I mean, I saw Andre the Giant, and there were some of them that were also local, and that lived kind of in the neighborhood, and who we had exchanges with. As it turns out, Hulk Hogan, as you probably know, I mean, he went to Robinson High School in Tampa, and his real name is Terry Bollea, and Terry, his wife, had a restaurant in the Tampa Bay area for some time. So it was funny. I used to, when we would go to the beach on holiday, just near where I grew up, and on Reddington Beach in particular, next door to us was this condominium. And as it turned out, Hulk Hogan had a condo there. So we would often see he and Randy Macho Man Savage walking the beach, or with their cigarette boat, you know, like right,
the sun.
unbelievable. Like he was truly, like, coming up on him, he is truly this giant, you know. I mean, it's really phenomenal. But there are also these really interesting stories. I wrote a book about the band Devo for a British publisher, SAF Publishing. It was the first book about the 80s band that sang the song Whip It, but they're kind of this post-punk new wave band from the 1970s, had a kind of one hit in 1980-81. But some of the people connected with them used to sort of also be on the circuit, and they would connect with some of those wrestlers, because it was very much you know, a sort of traveling show. And they told me the story once about Terry Bollea, about Hulk Hogan, and about how they would show up, you know, and be staying in some hotel, and it would be he and, you know, a number of the professional wrestlers that actually also had an interest in music. And Terry, in high school, apparently at Roosevelt High School, had a band. And so I can't remember if he played bass or if he played guitar, but they would come down to the bar, and they would get drunk, and at some point they would take over whoever was playing live in the hotel's bar. You know, like if there were some local band playing, they would come up and they would, you know, take their instruments out of their hands, and then they would do these jam sessions, basically. But like, who wasn't going to lend them, you know, their guitar? You know, these giant guys, you know. So, but one of the other interesting things about that is they also, and maybe you've delved into some of this, but they also had their own language, you know, that is this kind of Carney speak, which it ties very closely, and I think you maybe mentioned it, to sort of the sideshow, and it's the same language that, as an outsider, you know, it's impenetrable. It's like, you know, they have a way in which they talk that allows them to communicate with each other in the ring to sort of set up what the next move is going to be.
Yeah,
you know, but
its own dialect, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. Yeah. So you've looked into that a bit. I think, you know, that's such an interesting thing to talk about. So I'm also pretty friendly with a guy named Johnny Mia, and Johnny is like the last of the sideshow carnival painters. He would paint the sideshow paintings, backdrops, but also was a sword swallower, and he is able to have conversations with these wrestlers. You know, they can speak their own language completely, because he grew up in the sideshow carnival sort of circuit, and these guys were so closely connected, you know. So anyway, I think you're mining some very fertile, you know, ground with all of this. And I don't know if you know, but do you know the artist Carlos Amorales? I think he's shown in London a bit, you know, and he's artist who's based in Mexico City, and I met him when he was in the Netherlands for a time, and I did his first museum exhibition in the United States. He did a project that you should have a look at. You'll probably find a good bit online, but he did a project where there's a very distinct difference, as I'm sure you know, between sort of the American wrestling and what happens in Mexico and the lucha libre, the luchadors. Yeah. So he did a project where and it's true, obviously, in the United States too, like characters who, like Hulk Hogan, who are seen as the heroes, often you know, become the enemies, or become the, you know, they sort of go back and forth occasionally, where you know, they'll even, you know, put them in a mask, or they'll do. But in Mexico, there are wrestlers that are essentially for hire, that are still in the highest rank of the leagues, but they will change their masks and they'll play different characters. So this artist, Carlos Amarales, worked with one of the original mask makers for all of the Lucha Libre. And he had that mask maker make a mask of his face. And then he hired a professional wrestler who is in the high rankings, you know, and took him on the road essentially in Mexico to wrestle as his character. And again, it was because he's not a wrestler and he's not a big athletic guy. The idea was to, you know, put this person in the mask of his face. And so anyway, he's someone that I think you would find of interest, you know. And again, it's Carlos Amarales, but we could send you a link or something. You'll find a lot about him. And maybe, you know, as you're thinking about like this documentary, you know, it could be interesting to sort of, you know, look at how some of these things have been represented. The other person that I could connect you with that is an old friend is a guy named John Capulla, who wrote the first book on the wrestler Gorgeous George.
Oh, Gorgeous
and I don't know if
George.
you know Gorgeous George.
Yeah, it was Ric Flair's inspiration, I believe.
You got it. I mean, he was Muhammad Ali's inspiration. He was Evel Knievel's inspiration. And he's someone that I think, even if you are getting into this thing about the 90s, you know, he's certainly worth talking about. You know, the first you know, museum project that I curated was with a New York artist named Keith Edmeyer, and we did his first museum show at the Contemporary Art Museum in Tampa. And at the time, do you know Evel Knievel?
Yeah.
You know that name? Yeah. In the 70s, he was motorcycle daredevil, and you know, he actually,
in his body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And exactly. And you know, his one of the sort of final jumps, which tragically, you know, did not end well. He broke his back and pelvis, was at Wembley Stadium. So there's you know, an interesting connection to the UK with Knievel, but Evel hugely influenced by you know, by Gorgeous George, also friendly with Muhammad Ali and very much, you know, a major celebrity in the 1970s. Evel was still alive in the 1990s when you know, Keith Edmeyer and I kind of proposed this exhibition, this project. And Keith had the idea of actually collaborating with Evel. And so we worked for, you know, for a number of months in advance of this exhibition. I connected with Knievel's agent, and then we went for this sort of meeting with Evel Knievel, which was one of the most extraordinary, you know, experiences of my life, but was incredible because it very much connects with the underlying themes that you're addressing too. You know, this kind of larger than life popular culture character who, you know, had the highest rated you know, television appearances, but the exchange with Knievel and seeing the connection too with you know, with professional wrestling stuff was just extraordinary. You know, it was the first curatorial project I had done, but in that, Knievel asked, you know, we went out drinking with him at a bar, and basically Knievel said, you know, how are you intending to promote this exhibition? And, you know, I kind of naively just said, well, you know, I mean, with your involvement, you know, that it can't not, you know, be noticed. But beyond that, you know, we'll write a press release, and we'll hope that the local newspaper will do a feature, undoubtedly, and I think, you know, a lot of people will take an interest. And he was like, no, you know, like let me make a telephone call. So we're at this bar, and Knievel picks up the phone, and he makes a call, and it's kind of the middle of the night, but as it turned out, he was calling the former producer of ABC Wide World of Sports, right? So this major national that had featured all the Muhammad Ali fights, had always been kind of the exclusive television channel and program that would feature his motorcycle jumps. And he calls this guy in the middle of the night and basically says, I'm doing this show at this little art space, and we need you to fly a crew down from New York to film the opening of this art exhibition with this young artist who was in his, you know, we were both in our mid-20s at the time, but saying that, you know, you need to send some folks down here to cover this. It's going to be one of the most important events ever, you know, and he's sort of playing this up in this way. And the conversations with Knievel were incredible to me because, you know, I'd always thought about the context of art. And of course, you know, there are these connections to celebrity and whatever, but, and this certainly was that in a way, but just as a showman and as this hyper masculine, you know, kind of character figure who at once was also someone who had been physically damaged in ways that, you know, he could barely walk, you know, and as he aged because of having had so many surgeries, he actually had hepatitis and had to have a liver transplant, and that didn't work. And, you know, so we were kind of catching him when his physicality was, you know, he had really lost any sense of his physicality. He wasn't, you know, he was quite fragile during that period. But I think what you would find if you pursue this documentary idea is that, you know, a lot of these characters from the 1990s are probably having and going through the same sort of ailments, and, you know, your investigation of this, you know, this form of hyper masculinity and you know, masochism could be really interesting if you were able to sort of set up, you know, an interview with Terry Bollea or you know, whomever still survives. I think Randy Macho Man Savage passed away, right? Some of these guys have definitely are no longer with us, even from the 90s, right? So anyway, sorry to go off on a tangent.
I
think what you're I think what you're doing is really very interesting. So but I also love that you're pursuing kind of the film idea too. And I remember in your statement you mentioned, you know, an interest in people like Christian Marclay. Of course, you know, I don't know if you've had the chance to see The Clock or some of those things, but you know, Christian is one of my favorite artists, someone I've worked with a bit. I also wondered if you'd seen, I mean, just in watching those works, like the one with sort of the soccer celebrations and also all of those related to the WWF, if you'd seen the work of Paul Pfeiffer. He's someone that you should take a look at. There's stuff online, but it's Pfeiffer, Paul Pfeiffer, and he was first in a Whitney Biennial in like 2000. You know, he's an artist who's been working since the 90s, but he was based in Hawaii, and he did a lot of things that had to do with editing video, you know, of professional basketball games, and then sort of taking out all the logos and taking out all of the identifiers beyond sort of the stadium and the grandiose gestures, and in ways that I think were pretty interesting. But in any event, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on what you're doing, you know, sculpturally, and how that kind of plays in too, because it seems like, you know, there are two currents in your work somehow, in terms of what you're doing with found footage from pop culture, and then what you're doing sculpturally, or in terms of thinking about installation-based work. How did you come to some of this that we're seeing right now?
Well, I was doing a unit on my contextual research that was surrounding like architecture and specifically modernism. And so I was very much interested in like both the shapes that are used in that sort of architecture and like the material like wealth of it. So there's a lot of concrete and steel, and it's this very sort of industrial sense of building, like and creating stuff with it. So I was like casting massive blocks of concrete and then dragging them around. But in terms of that relating into what I'm doing at the moment, it's been a bit of a bridge in my work, to be honest, because
Yeah.
I came out of a residency in Venice where I'd been working with like blocks of found concrete and metal bars to sort of, and it is very much a product of not having the material to create something more intricate and trying to make something more direct. And then it sort of transferred into this idea of like the cycles of birth and decay, and how we've seen a lot of this modernist architecture now is being like torn down and replaced for the new modern in a way. And this idea of the one sculpture, I don't know if you've seen the video of it, there was metal tubes were dripping water down onto the concrete, and I had like fertilizer dissolved in the tubes.
Oh.
And there was this idea of like there's clay that was in with the concrete as well, so it was like the concrete was sort of like deteriorating as it was coming into contact with the moisture. And that was an exploration into just the cyclic nature of that. But yeah, I've not really visited that since January last year. It wasn't so much a conscious decision, it was more of a moment of inspiration where I just found that I've been working as a videographer as well, so I found that working with video has been a sort of an easier way for me to like express myself creatively, both making my own footage and appropriating footage of others.
Absolutely. Well, and it sounds like your plan is graduate school in filmmaking. So,
Yeah.
but so this is a kind of making those sculptural installations is something that you've moved on from a bit. I mean, it's not something
I can definitely see myself revisiting, but like sculpture in the context of like exploring architecture is something that I would feel I've moved on for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would just say it's really a pleasure to meet you. I'm so happy to sort of see the work that you're doing and to be able to have a little bit of a conversation. You know, I hope that we can stay in touch, and best of luck. Keep me posted about your you know, as you move on with going to graduate school.